Hello, hello. Okay, there we go. Now we're on there. Oh my God. Things are going like really crazy. Um, I'm supposed to be streaming with Hikaru, and things have just gone completely nuts. So I'm trying to get connected now. Let's see what we've got here. All right, we've got that going. And then in the meantime, we've got to get Twitch going here. It's just crazy. Oh, there. Hey, Hikaru. Oh my God, dude, I'm so sorry. I had this for 6:45 and then I saw your message and I was like, "Oh my God, I'm the guy who's always on time." Okay. Okay. Yeah, no problem. I'm live by the way, just in case you were about to say something horrible. Okay, that's fair. Oh, and people can't even hear you on my stream, so I'm going to fix that and then we're going to be just beautiful. All right, now you guys should be able to hear him.
Right.
There we go.
Okay.
Wow.
Yeah. All
Wow.
right. Give me 1 second. Okay, should be pretty good. Oh, you're super professional.
Thank you. Well, I'm 15 minutes late, which is not the most professional thing, but
That's a very valid point. Make sure. Okay, I think you look pretty good. Let's make sure. Okay. All right. I think we are good to go. So,
beautiful.
make sure. Okay. All right. So what's that?
We're live.
Right. Yeah. So I guess first and foremost, what is your background with chess? I tend to ask it a lot of people before I give them lessons.
Well, it's an ugly background. It's I mean basically I just got into it like a year and a half ago
Uh huh.
and I'm not getting any better, but I enjoy it.
Oh,
And
okay.
I've taken a few lessons here and there and then somehow I'm in a tournament later this month and it could be horribly embarrassing for me.
Well, what I would say first and foremost is that actually, out of all the players that I've seen, you're one of the early favorites.
Really? I didn't know that there was a line on this.
I wouldn't say there's an official line, but from what I've seen, there's certain people who have more experience. So like when you say that you just started a year ago and you're not improving, you're one of the better players that I've seen so far. Just your general understanding of the game.
Oh my God. I don't
So,
know what that says about me or the competition.
well, I think everyone has a different kind of way of picking up the game. Some people pick it up quicker than other people, is what I would say.
You know, what I was going to ask you was, as a
Mm-hmm.
grandmaster, if you meet an adult who just isn't very good at chess and like you show them a few things and they're not getting any better, do
Mm-hmm.
you question their general intelligence? Like, does somebody like you see any chess ability at all as a proxy to general intelligence?
Um, in general, I don't think that I view it that way. What I would say is that in order to be good at chess, you have to have a certain. Let me invite you to this board first. Is that you have to have a certain sort of knack for spatial recognition. Some
Okay.
like spatial recognition or just general pattern recognition in order to be good at chess. So if someone is not improving at chess, I wouldn't necessarily say that that means they're not smart, because there are a couple of people I know. For example, there's this professor I know at Princeton, and he's about like 1700. But he's been working on string theory for a very long time, but he's been stuck at this rating for probably the last like 10 years, I think, at least, and he hasn't been improving. But he's obviously a very smart guy outside of chess, so I don't tend to look at it from that standpoint of like, if you're not good at chess, you're stupid. That's just not how I view it. I think like critical thinking and spatial awareness and pattern recognition are important, but I don't think that's what makes you smart or not smart. So I don't tend to think like that.
That's good. So maybe if I implode during the tournament, it won't necessarily kill my political analysis career.
No, I think I'm trying not to say anything too off the cuff, but what I would say is that in terms of politics, I think it would be nice if there were more people who did play games like chess, who did use critical thinking, and they were logical in their approach to
Right.
politics, instead of sort of to just say anything you want to say and not have a deep understanding or reasoning behind what they're saying.
That makes sense to me.
And just like, this isn't really political per se, but one thing that I found very interesting is that if you go back in history, I believe the first like 5 or 6 U.S. presidents all played chess. George Washington played chess. Thomas Jefferson did. I think James Madison was an avid chess player, and even Benjamin Franklin. He played a lot of chess when he was in Paris as the ambassador for the U.S. To France. So I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I've always thought that's kind of interesting when you look at it from the political standpoint.
Well, it seems like probably at the time, a cultured gentleman was expected to play chess, right? I mean, that's really changed now. If you say to me, hey, the governor of Florida is 2200, I would say there's no way that that's the case, just looking at the guy and hearing him talk. But he's not a cultured gentleman in the way that some of these old time politicians were.
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot that I could say about the governor of Florida, and I will try to refrain. But yeah, certainly I think in the old days it was considered one of those things that they looked at as being a game that really, it was sort of upper class per se. It's something that a lot of people who were smart, they played it when they or if they were cultured, they would play the game. So
right.
It certainly used to be true. Nowadays, I think chess still has that, but it's not. I don't know. I think there are a lot of other things people can do. Well.
I think that's a beautiful way to say it.
Yeah, but it's one of those games that a lot of people, a lot of very smart scientists, mathematicians used to play. And also, when you look at some of the really strong chess players going back like 30 to 40 years, they were able to excel in fields besides chess. So like they're one of the world chess champions, Vasily Smyslov from Russia. He was also a professional musician on top of being the world champion in chess. And another world champion, Mikhail Botvinnik, also Russian, who was instrumental in sort of developing the Russian school and the Russian approach to chess. He also was a computer engineer, a computer scientist, and involved with some of the earliest computer chess programs.
What's your sense, not to get off track, because I know we have big training to do, but what's your sense of, like, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems as though somewhere between early to mid or sometimes late 30s, the top chess players start to decline.
Yes.
And I saw your video looking at, the top ranked chess players over time and, so on and so forth. You would think that it's not like basketball where like we understand why when you're 35, you're all of a sudden not going to be quite as good, right? It's sort of a different sort of thing. What is the limitation that starts to drag players down at 35 to 38? Is it that the long form games, you might be thinking about a move intensely for 90 minutes and that your stamina is what starts to get you?
Yeah, so basically the biggest difference is what technology has changed for the game. So if you go back, let's say pre-1995, because I would say 95 is when computers really started getting good to the point where we could learn from them. If you go back before then, due to the sort of lack of technology, a lot of players could play openings for their entire career. So imagine, for example, that I believe you play the Vienna opening with white.
To say I play it is a bit of a stretch, but let's go with it, yeah.
So like if you play the Vienna opening and you just accumulate years and years of experience of playing it from when you were very young as a child, you could probably play that opening your entire career. Because the lack of information, the lack of sort of knowledge that people had on the openings and the games that the players were playing meant that you could play openings for your whole career. And that experience, the accumulation of it, it would mean that you become better and better as you age. But nowadays what happens is that because of the technology, first of all, every game you play can be analyzed by your opponents. And secondarily, with the computers, someone can probably know whether your opening approach is good or bad within 5 minutes. If they just open the computer engines and they study the game, within 5 minutes, they will know if what you played is good or bad. And so nowadays, as you're getting better and playing more and more, you have to keep coming up with new ideas and you have to use more energy at the board. Whereas before, it was much more sort of you do your preparation and the game is very interesting at the start and someone makes a blunder early. Now people don't make blunders because of the influence of computers, and so the games get decided deeper and deeper, which in turn means you use more and more energy both away from the board and at the board in order to try and win and get better.
And so that's why in the mid to late 30s, the best players tend to start to decline.
Yes, because in the old days, I think the peak of chess players was probably in their mid 30s, actually. It was probably mid 30s, and you could play until you were probably, I would say, around late 40s, maybe even up into the early 50s. A couple of the world champions were still very competitive till then. But nowadays, because the amount of effort, the work you have to put in before the game and then during the game, it's just the stamina. And you don't think of chess as being like physical, but you do have to be in pretty good shape. Because when you think about the competitions, you're studying 5 hours a day. You play a game that's another 5 to 6 hours. And you do this for weeks on end. As you're getting older, it takes more and more energy.
Right. I saw this crazy interview with the notorious anti-Semite Bobby Fischer on the Dick Cavett show years ago. And far be it from me to defer to an anti-Semite on anything. But one of the things he seemed to say in his kind of haze of paranoia was that he seemed frustrated that chess became about just who has memorized further into a game. Like, first 5 moves, 10, 15, 20, 25. And that it basically just became a memorization contest. And that seemed to be part of what made him lose interest, as well as he seemed to want to focus more on researching conspiracies about Jews.
Yeah, so what I would say about Fischer is there are a couple things. First of all, he sort of foresaw what you have in modern day chess with a lot of the memorization techniques being used in the opening phase of the game. But what I would say is one of the things that's very beautiful about chess is that there are some tournaments that are going on right now featuring top chess players. And there was a game yesterday in one of these events where the world champion and another player who's in the top 10 played, and on actually it wasn't the world champion, but on like move 7 of the game, they had a new position that had never been seen before in the entire history of chess. And that was on move 7. So yes, there is a lot of memorization. They're just, that's what openings are these days. But still, there is a lot of creativity and room for new ideas, especially because with the new program AlphaZero, the DeepMind Google project, you're seeing computers sort of play the game a little bit differently. And so we're trying to learn from some of the things that they're doing, some of the strategies they're employing, and trying to use that in our own games.
That makes a lot of sense.
And then just like in general, I would also say I had a conversation. I think this was shortly after Fischer died, if I remember correctly. I was at the Marshall Chess Club in New York City, and Dick Cavett, he was there at the time, and I spoke briefly with him on this topic, and he seemed to be under the impression that basically Fischer went insane because of the pressure of sort of the system playing against the Soviets. Mainly just like all the pressure, it just built up and he kind of exploded, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's certainly seemed to be.
So yeah, I never had the chance to meet Fischer. Obviously, I wish I had, but it's hard to know what the realities are. But it's what it is, I guess.
It certainly is, yes. So from the standpoint of this tournament, I mean, what needs to be, it's like different people I've been working with. We look at some openings as white. We look at a strategy as black that maybe does or doesn't depend on what my opponent plays. Everybody can see what everybody's being taught, right? Like my future opponents could be watching this stream and so on and so forth. So do I need more theory, general ideas, or do I need specific openings?
So I think some of the openings that I've seen that you play are pretty standard, and it's not about memorization. See, that's one of the things that I think is interesting. Like, to use one of the things that I love about chess is the way you can extrapolate it into other fields of life. And so, like, one thing is when I look at chess in terms of education, very specifically, and with chess, there is no set method of learning for one person. Like, certain people get really good from just like memorizing, looking over and over at the same things. Other people learn from playing. Other people learn from doing puzzles. Everyone sort of has a different method of learning. And so, like, what I intend to show you is not the openings, because I think you already have a pretty good grasp on them, and that's not where you're going to win the games once you're in the championship bracket. Maybe I'm putting my hopes too high on you already by saying the championship bracket, but I do expect you to be in the top 8.
Holy shit.
So what I would say is that, like, it's more about like knowing the middle games than end games. Like, I want to show you some end games, because it's sort of stuff that if you get it down, like if you know what to do with the concepts, you will see some of these things start to occur in the games when you're matched up against players of the same rating range or the same strength.
Right. Like in the board we're looking at now, it seems I need to avoid a stalemate, right? It's the strategy to avoid stalemate.
Right. So this is king and pawn against king. This is one of the most basic end games. Very few pieces on the board. Now this end game is winning for white, but I'm gonna show you just a basic start. So let's just say you push the pawn. Okay, you can make moves as well. So let's say black moves the king. What would you play as white here?
I think I'd probably move the king up.
Right. And so now if I go here, okay. So do you know what the result of this position would be with the king and the pawn versus the king?
Well, I mean, I guess I'd want to not get. I want to avoid these squares because then I lose the pawn. So I'd be looking at one of these two, and then the king would have to move away, I think,
Right.
and then I would move up and then
Right.
just kind of try to start pushing the king back.
Correct. So you want to use the king and the pawn, and you want to escort the pawn up the board to make a queen. Now the problem with this this position is it's actually a draw. Because what's the law? How do you try to proceed to get this pawn to the end of the board?
Right. I mean, I guess.
Right. Mm-hmm. And so, do you see what's going to happen here?
Right.
So this is a draw. Now, if we go back one move, let's say we get to let me just make a wrong move. Let me say I move my king here instead of staying basically opposite the pawn. Is white can now go here, and when the king goes here, you push the pawn, and white's winning.
Right.
Because now my king has to move, and then what's your next move?
Uh,
Right, and you make a queen. I assume you know how to mate with a king and queen.
I think so. Maybe we should still review it.
Okay, so all right. So try to make the checkmate.
So let's see. I think that there's some idea where I want to basically like create a smaller and smaller box for the king, right?
Correct.
For the opposing king. So I guess here I'd go here.
Okay. Okay. Mm-hmm. Good.
I often end up in stalemate here, so now I have to think ahead.
That's stalemate. Right.
That was the mistake.
So what you want to do is like when you get the king to like this square, for example, you can go
Yep.
queen. Actually, instead of here, you can go queen here.
Okay.
And once you get basically the king is cut off, right? It can't come up to the second rank. It's stuck
Yep.
here between these two squares. What you want to do is when the king gets to the corner and there are only two squares, then you bring the king, and then you make the checkmate.
Got it.
And it's actually the same. Like even if the king is here, for example, you can also cut it off like this. You see how it's now cut off this way?
Yep.
It has these two squares. So when the king goes here, you go here, and make the checkmate.
So the idea is at some point restrict the king either horizontally or vertically to just one rank or file, and then move my king up until the checkmate move.
Right. Basically, you want to get the king to where it only has these two corner squares.
Right.
Where it can only go to these two or these two. And then you bring the king and you just mate on like this square.
Right.
With the king and the queen. So it seems like more or less you do have it. You should have it down. It doesn't seem like I don't know. Do you want to try to do it again? Let's see if you can do it from this position. Let's go here.
Okay. So now I would be at the point where I want to make sure you don't get beyond the second rank.
Right. Now, one thing you can also do is you can also use your queen to force the king to the corner as well.
In this position?
Yeah. So how is there a way you can force the king to the edge of the board, like horizontally or vertically to the last rank?
Would it be maybe? Oh no, that doesn't make sense. With a queen move now, maybe here.
Right. Now, so do you see what happens when you move the queen here? The king it only has 3 squares. So let's say I go to this square.
Yep. I think I would start moving the king in.
You can, but you know what else you can do here? You can also go here.
Okay, right.
And so now there are 3 squares. So it's not quite to the very corner, but what you can do after this move is you can move the king. I move my king, and how do you force the king to the final 2 corner squares?
I think for now I keep moving my king in.
Yeah, you can move your king. Yeah, actually, it doesn't matter. That's fine. If that's what works best, then that's fine. So, okay. And when I go here,
I think I move the king in again.
Mm-hmm.
And then now here.
Right, and that's checkmate. So yeah, you clearly, it's not super hard for you. You understand cutting off the king vertically or horizontally, and when you play queen d3, let's say I go this way. How do you cut off the king here?
So here.
Right, exactly.
And then now I start moving the king in.
But if you do, but actually you don't want to go down here. You want to go up because if you go here, what happens is in this position, your king can't come over.
Got it.
So what you want to do is, in this position, you bring the king up and around like this. Basically.
Got it.
Like this. Mm-hmm. Right, and that's checkmate. So that's good. I just wanted to make sure to see that you had the king and queen mate down, but you clearly do. So let's go back to this now. Let's go back to the starting position. We established that this position with the king in front of the pawn like this is going to be a draw, right?
Yep.
So the main thing is, let's say you're on the defending side, what you need to remember is that when the pawn gets to this 6th rank where it's 2 squares away from queening, you keep the king opposite. You keep the king right in front of the pawn. You don't go to one of the sides if you're defending. You keep the king right in front of it, and then whichever way I go with my king up to one of these squares, you always go to the side that the king is here. So you go like over, and if I go here, where would you go? Right. So yeah, you just keep it opposite, and then when I check, you come over, so that my next move means it's a draw.
Got it.
So back to the start. So obviously, if you push this pawn up the board, I'm just going to keep my king in front of the pawn, and this is going to be a draw. So
yes, it is.
This is where there's a way that you can actually win this game by force. And so the way that you win is actually something that's not very intuitive, because normally you think you push the pawn up the board and make a queen, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm guessing it would either be e3 to start or maybe moving the king first.
Yeah, so it's not a pawn move. What it is you bring the king up. Which, okay, of course, yeah, why not move the king up? That seems pretty straightforward. But the way that you win here is by using the king and bringing it in front of the pawn.
Got it. Because then it prevents the king from actually getting close enough to the pawn.
Right. So I want to see if you can... Right. And now, so I'm going to go here.
I mean, okay, I guess this would be my instinct, but maybe there's some other trick.
So I go here.
Okay, so now do I move in the same direction as the king or the opposite direction? Maybe same direction.
You could do that, but actually if you do this, I just go back.
Oh, okay.
And the problem here is now if you push the pawn, we're in the same position again.
Right.
Where we're going to end up where you push the pawn, I just keep the king straight on these, going right
and
back.
I can't get the king back in front of the pawn.
Right. So what you do here is actually you go the other way. You go king here.
Okay.
So now let's say I bring my king up. I want to see if you can figure out how to win this position for white. How you can push the pawn up the board, use the king of the pawn, and go straight up the board and make a queen.
Okay, so I'm guessing it's one of these two moves that I'm looking for. I guess let's see.
Okay, so now I'm going to go here.
And now this is blocked. So maybe that was the wrong one.
No, it's the right move.
Oh, it is. Oh, do I do this again?
Okay.
That doesn't seem to make sense. Oh, okay.
Okay, so now I'm going to go here.
Okay, so if I go here, the king can't access this square. So maybe that's okay.
But do you see what's going to happen now?
It's that same position from before.
Right, and so it's a draw.
Yep.
So what you do here is you don't actually push the pawn. You move the king over.
Okay.
So the problem here is, do you see what's going to happen? What happens if I go here?
Now I go this way?
Right, and I can never stop your pawn from queening.
Right.
Because your king guards all three of these squares. That you're just gonna push the pawn up the next three squares, and I can't stop that.
Got it.
Because when I go here, you just push. I go here, you just push, and you make the queen. Because the king guards all the critical squares, and it's winning.
And so on this path up the board, it seems like it was it here and this square?
So we have a term for this, and it's called the opposition,
Okay.
which is basically the kings. You see how the kings are opposite each other right here.
Mm-hmm.
So what you want is in this position, you want it where when it's the opposition, your opponent who only is the king and they move, whichever way they go, you go the other direction.
Got it.
So in this position, if it's white's move, this is actually a draw. And the reason it's a draw is because when I go here, actually wait, if I let me just make a couple of random moves. Is that the reason this is a draw is because of its white's move, and I go here. Where do you move to keep the opposition with the king?
As black?
Yes. I mean, I can flip the board too, I guess.
I mean, I guess you go here.
Well, there's a
or
word
here.
I said keep the opposition. So how do you keep the opposition here with where?
Oh, you want to? So I guess here.
Right. And so do you see what happens if in this position, if it's white's move, black always has the opposition where the kings remain opposite each other, and wherever I go, like even if I go this way, you go the same direction as the king, you keep the opposition, and then once I push the pawn, how do you draw the endgame?
Back here.
And right, and so now I can't get my king in front of the pawn, so I have to push here.
And then back here.
Remember what I said. When the king is in front of the pawn, you want to keep the king where
right. So then just back.
Right. And when I go here, so to
back
keep the
again?
opposition. Well, okay, if you go here, what is white's next move, though?
I guess here.
That works, but this is the correct move.
Oh, okay. Putting the king in front. Right. Okay.
Right, and then whichever way the king goes, you go up one square, and then you push the pawn and make a queen again.
Yep. So as white, I want to be going in the opposite direction. As black, you want to be basically staying in front of the pawn as much as possible.
The king. Yeah, you want to keep the opposition, the kings opposite each other when you can.
Yep.
So like in this position, you always want to keep the king here.
Got it.
And so when I push the pawn, what's the next move? Right. And now remember, now that you have to move the king back. Right. So this is the point. And now when I go here, right, keeping the opposition, keeping the kings opposite each other. And so this is just a draw now.
Right.
So
because here and then here, right?
Or wait, sorry, what was that?
so it would be yeah, right.
And then white has to go over, and it's a draw.
Yep.
So let's go back to the start. Let's see if you can win this with white.
Okay. So first king.
Right. So I'm gonna move my king. The problem with this is now my king.
Right. No, I'm putting the king in front first.
Right. So now I'm just gonna move my king.
Yep. Okay. So I want to go the opposite way, right?
Right. Okay. So now I'm going to try to keep the opposition. I'm going to try to keep my king opposite your king.
Okay. So now I play pawn.
That's fine. And I go here.
I put the king back in front.
Right. And so now again, I have to move. So I can't keep the opposition. I have to move my king. I can't keep the king opposite your king. Right. Okay. So now I'll go here. What you need to do here is actually move the king over first.
Oh, okay.
Because if you move the pawn, I now move my king and I get the opposition again.
Okay, right.
So what you do is you move the king, and now again I have to move my king because I can't keep the opposition.
Right. Now here, do I go pawn or do I move my king again?
Well, remember you don't want to push the pawn because then I can go back and I get the opposition.
Oh, it's the same position, right? Okay. So here.
Right. And so now let's say I go here.
Okay, that's a good. So
remember,
now
the opposition is from the side now, so it's not the same opposition. So what
yeah.
do you do?
Well, if I move my pawn here, I think I lose the pawn, right? Or maybe not. No. Do I move back?
Well, remember the goal is you want to get the pawn to the end of the board.
Yeah.
So what you actually should play is you should push the pawn.
Okay.
So now I'm going to go back.
Now I go back in front?
Not yet. You still can push the pawn.
Okay.
And so now what happens if I go king here?
Okay, so let's see. Then I'm controlling these. So you have to end up somewhere here.
But remember, at the end of the day, where do you ideally want your king? Remember, you want to get a queen.
Well, eventually it's going to have to be to the side of this file.
Right. And which square controls all the critical squares?
This
you
one.
can put your king on a square. Right. Because I can't attack the pawn.
Right.
And so now when I go here. Right. Right. And you're just going to make a queen next move.
Yep.
So basically what you want to do is at the start of this, when you bring this king up, at a certain point, black is going to try to keep the opposition where the kings are opposite each other. And when you reach this opposition, what you do here is to break it. Is now you can play the waiting move with the pawn. So now my king has to move. I can't keep my king opposite your king the way I would like to.
Right.
And whichever way I go, you go the other way.
Right.
And so, and again, if I come up here, what's your next move?
Pawn.
I come back.
I think here.
Right. And so now I go back. Right. And now when I go to the back rank.
Now I go in front? No, over.
And when I go here. Right. And now again, your king gets the critical square on this side, and the pawn is just going up the board.
Yep. Yep.
So again, this is the opposition. Now this probably won't happen much, but it's important to remember not so much because of the specific endgame, but this idea that you can get your king where it can escort the pawn all the way up the board. Because this will likely happen in a couple of your games if you reach an endgame.
Yep.
Where like you'll have a king and you'll need to use the king a lot to escort the pawn up the board.
And so the thought process I need to be thinking of is which three squares do I eventually want to control so that the opposing king can't stop my pawn?
Right, exactly. So let's try it from the start. Let's see if you can win this against me.
Okay. King. I think in front.
Right. So now I'm trying to keep the opposition again.
Okay, so now I think now it's pawn still.
Okay, so I go here.
I think it's pawn again.
No, but remember again, when there's the opposition. So let's do it this way. The easiest way to remember this is here. Move the king over and put the king 2 squares where the pawn has. Sorry, put the king on e4 where you have 1 square for the pawn. Okay.
Right.
So because I'm trying to create the opposition, so put the king here, and then when you have the opposition on the same file that this pawn is here, now what's your next move?
Now I push the pawn.
Right. And so now when I go here.
Then here.
Right. And so now, okay, so now I'm going to go back.
Pawn.
So now I'm trying to get the opposition. Or wait, no, not pawn, sorry. What you need to do here is you always need to keep a spot for the pawn to go ahead.
Got it.
So how do you, right. And so now I have to go over. And now remember, you don't want to let me get the opposition here. Because my idea is, right. And so now when I come up to try and get towards your pawn. Right, so I go back. Right, and now you force me back to this back rank. Right, and now. Exactly, and again, you just push this pawn all the way up the board and you make a queen.
Yep.
So this is not super intuitive or easy, but I think it's important to try and remember this notion of getting the king, using the opposition of where when your opponent is trying to keep the opposition with the 2 kings opposite each other, is you don't want to get into a spot where it's say like this. If it's this move and it's white's move, it's a draw, right?
Yeah.
Because you can never get the king off to the side and use the king and the pawn to go up the board.
Right.
So I'm not explaining this very well, but it's essentially all about the opposition here. Like what you want is you want this position where you can keep the king in front of the pawn, force the king off to one of the sides where the king cannot keep the opposition, and then you escort the pawn up the board.
Now, if my opponent doesn't know what they're supposed to be doing to play this perfectly, then what does my strategy become? Just to move the pawn up if the king is not one move away from
So,
doing their ideal
for
move?
example, let's say I put my king back here.
Yep.
Or let me say I leave my king right here. You would still use the same strategy. You want to keep the pawn back to where you can always push it at the critical moment when your opponent tries to get opposition. So let's say you
Okay.
go king here. I'm just going to make a random move like this. What you would do is, again, you can play, you can go king here to keep the opposition, right? And now your opponent has to move the king.
Right.
So when he moves the king, it doesn't matter here because like if you go up, I just come here, and then if you push, I come up, and I'm threatening to win the pawn.
Right.
But here there are 2 squares to push the pawn. So what you would do here is you push again, and when your opponent goes back to get the opposition, you push again. And so now the king has to move off, and then what's the next move? Right, and you just push the pawn. Next 3 moves, make the queen, and then you'll make the checkmate.
Now, is there some, like, if my opponent's not playing this perfectly, is there some imaginary box where I don't want the pawn getting more than a certain distance from the king? Because then I could get into trouble?
Generally, what I would say is what you want is you want to keep the distance, probably not more than two squares apart.
Okay.
Like here, there are 2 squares between. Because if there are more squares between, like, for example, let's say you go here, then if you try to push the pawn, you'll see that it's still winning, but you have to bring your king back to push the pawn up. So you have to waste some moves. So I would say like not more than 2. Try to keep it as 2 squares between them.
Makes sense.
Okay, so let me open a new board. This is going to be the same concept but slightly different. I don't know. Do you kind of understand that?
Yeah. I mean, I've gotten into situations, not so much with this, but certainly like where I end up stalemating with rook and king or stuff like that, where it's useful to think through this.
Okay, so I'm going to bring up another position. Let me invite you to this board. Okay, so you should have gotten the invite, I think, to this board as well.
Yep.
Okay. All right. So you see this position. This is again king and pawn versus king and pawn. Now, one thing. Well, I'll make the first move because the first move is pretty obvious for white. You want to bring the king up, and how would you win this game? Let's just say I keep moving on the side.
Okay. I mean, I guess in theory, I would try to kind of escort the pawn up, but keeping it aware of this pawn so that I don't end up losing the pawn. Like, for example, I wouldn't move the pawn right now because then I just lose the pawn.
Right. So what you would do is notice where the kings are. This black king is much further away from both the black pawn and the white pawn.
So I might just try to use my king to capture the pawn and then turn it into the last situation.
So how would you try to capture the pawn?
I guess maybe here. Okay, so now I probably want to start moving this way.
Right, but actually, okay, so if you go here, I'm going to go king here. So now think about the previous position. What happens if you push this pawn? So like when you push the pawn, my king goes here.
Yep. It's the same draw position from before, right?
Right, and why is it a draw?
Because I can never force your king away.
Right, my king gets the opposition. You have to move your king. Whereas your opponent does not have to move their king.
Right.
So what you would do here is you would actually go king here.
Okay.
And so now when I go king here.
Pawn?
I go here to get the opposition.
Okay, so I don't want to push the pawn because then we've got that draw situation.
But it's not your move. So actually black has to break the opposition, not white. Like when you push the pawn, it's not your turn. So when you push the pawn, it's my turn, and I have to make a move.
Okay.
So then when I move my king, right? Yeah, exactly. And now, right? So you win the game. So it seems pretty easy and straightforward, right?
Yes.
So, sorry. Okay. All right. So what I'm going to say is, when black brings the king closer, if you get your king up where you capture the pawn, we've established this is just winning, right?
Now, one question about this position. Am I actually better off going behind the pawn in order to capture the black pawn?
You actually kind of are. So let's say I go here, and let's for the purpose of this example. Now, when you move your king here, I'm going to push my pawn.
Okay, I guess in this case I would just push my pawn.
Why would you not capture this pawn?
All right, that's a good question. I'm not sure.
Okay, so the position I put is slightly wrong because in this case, when you capture the pawn, you do win. Because if I go king here, you can just push this pawn up the board, and my king is
right.
so slow. It doesn't get over in time. But just for the example of this puzzle, the pawn is on the very edge of the board here. So if you push the pawn up the board, my king is in time to get over and capture it, right?
Yep.
So in this position, based on what I showed you before, how would you assume that you can win this position?
Starting with a king move.
Okay. So you move your king, and I'm going to move my king here.
Okay.
So my goal is to get my king in front of the pawn. You can't really stop me from getting the king over here.
Right. So do I put my king in front of the pawn or go in a different direction?
So what you would think should work is to put the king in front, right?
That would probably be my instinct.
Right. So now we're going to reach this position here. Now let's say you go king here, and I go here. You can push the pawn to break the opposition, because now my king has to move.
Yes.
There's only one problem, which is what happens when my king moves over?
Well, I only have two moves, and I don't know that either of them is good.
So
actually, wait, hold on. If I go here, though, now I'm controlling these three squares. Oh, no, I'm not yet controlling that square, right?
So what you really want here is in this position is you would like to be able to move your king off the board. You'd like to move it to the right, up one square, and then escort the pawn to the end of the board.
Beautiful.
But you can't do that. There's no extra file here.
Right. That's the problem.
So when you get the pawn on the very edge of the board like this, none of the rules with the opposition apply anymore because your king can only go this way to the left. There's no extra square. There's no square on I7. Your king can't go off the board. So
maybe back then I should not have captured the pawn.
Right, exactly. And so the point is that when you reach this end game, you need to be very aware that when you get pawns on the very edge of the board on either this H file or this A file, if you can push the pawn all the way down the board and make a queen, that's great. But if your opponent can get their king over, then it's a draw. It's always a draw.
And what's the calculation for whether the king can make it? Is it a 3x3 box?
It's just literally do the calculation of how many squares it takes. So like here, the way you would do it is like you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And you see it's 1, 2, 3, 4. So because it's 4, and actually let's say I go here. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, right?
Yep.
And it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Right.
So the king does not get over in time because it's 5. Now if it was 4 and 4, the king would get over.
Yep.
But it's 5. And it's 5. So like let's say it's black moved. Here it's let me just make a random move. Here you see it's 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's white's move. It's 1, 2, 3, 4. So the king gets over when the number is even.
Yeah.
But in this case, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and white moves first. So because white moves first, then it's 1, 2, 3 versus 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Right.
So like 5 minus 4 equals 1. In terms of the square, like what I would say is when it depends, like let's say here it's 4 squares to the end of the board. If the king is let's say king here, king here, king here, it's 4 to the end, but it's also 4 over. So when it's the same number over as the number of squares to push the pawn, then the king will get over in time.
Yes.
So I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So that's why, yeah, when I push the pawn, you can push the pawn up here. And when I bring my king over, how would you win this?
I think maybe now I head here.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Right. And so now when I go here, right, I go here, here. And when I move here, right, you move the king up and you're going to make a queen and you're going to win the game.
Yep.
So that one actually I thought would be a little bit harder, but it's not super hard. So now let's do another one. This is more like conceptual than like specific calculation, but This also I think is a famous one. So one second, let me just pull this up as well.
All right. Now, do you have this stuff saved, or do you literally just build it on the fly?
I can build it on the fly, but I do have these concepts. They're basically, burned into my memory. So like I do know this by heart.
Oh yeah, no, I just meant in terms of like sharing it. Are you actually putting a board together?
Oh yeah, because what I'm doing to put this up is I'm basically taking a file from chess software and I'm creating it. So yeah, I can definitely share it with you afterwards.
Got it.
Okay, so this is a position where it's white's move here. So it's again king and pawn versus king and pawn, and this is very famous because of there's a Gary Kasparov masterclass, and he actually goes over this specific one, and I know it's in the trailers everywhere. So everyone has seen this, but it's white's move here, right? So the pawns are on b6 and b7.
Yep.
So what's the quickest way to try to get to this pawn on b7?
Well, this square is inaccessible, so it seems this would be the first move.
And beyond that, so what's the quickest path to attack this pawn here?
Well, it's probably going to be this way because I'm guessing whether if black's next move is here, I don't have access to this square.
Right. And then after you go to e5, what's the next square?
Probably like this.
Okay. And then what's the next square?
Ooh, that's not so good.
Why?
Oh, wait, no, that's okay. Because then black can't take the pawn. They have to go here. Oh, but then I can't take the black pawn either. So that's a draw.
It's not a draw, actually. White loses the game.
Oh, okay.
So, but you do see the path, which is very, very good. So like when white goes here, black goes here.
Yep.
So now let's say white goes back, for example. Okay, I guess let's just flip the board so you see it from the black perspective here. So what would you play as black?
Oh, let me flip here. As black, I mean, I think I would still try to get towards the white pawn.
Mm-hmm. So, right. Now when I go here. Right. So now I'm going to go here. Right. And so now I go back. Well, remember, you want to get the opposition.
Oh, right.
So I'm going to go here.
Yep.
Now, you don't want to let white get the opposition.
I don't want to let white get the opposite. Oh, no. Okay, so...
if you push the pawn, I just go back.
Right,
and now
okay.
It's your move.
So I think I go this way?
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to go back. Right, I go here. Mm-hmm. So I'm trying to get the opposition.
I don't want to let white get the opposition.
Well, remember that white has the opposition right now.
Oh, right, but it's my turn. Okay, so I do
Right.
play pawn.
Right, so I go here.
Okay, and then here.
So I go here.
Nope.
Well, no, I mean, I guess in this case it works. So when I go here, right, and now, right, so now I have to move my king, and then, right, so you push the pawn and make the queen again.
Yeah.
So this is all about like the opposition, and so if you can just win this pawn with king f3, it's winning. But what white should try to do is go king here. But then what happens is king here, white goes here, black goes here to attack the pawn, right?
Yep.
And then when white goes here, black goes here.
Right.
So both kings are guarding the pawns, but based on whose move it is what decides the result. So let's say if it's white's move,
right,
white can't keep the king protecting the pawn.
But it seems if white were to move here,
there's a pawn.
Oh, right. So maybe white. Where does white move? That's a good question. To prevent losing the pawn.
White can't. White basically loses the game. This is what's called zugzwang.
Oh, this is too late. This has already been misplayed.
It's too late at the very start, actually.
Got
it's
it.
Too late. The point that I'm showing is like, what is the path here to try and win this pawn? It's 1, 2, 3, 4, and try to take the pawn. But black is 1, 2, 3, 4, and he protects the pawn.
Oh, so you don't even need. It's just a matter of the counting that we were talking about before, figuring out where the pieces are.
Right. This is a pure count. This is pure just counting. This one. Like, what is the easiest path for white to attack the pawn, and what's your path to attack this pawn?
Yep. Shorter path for black. Yeah.
Right. So the number is actually the exact same. It's 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. but because it's white's move, it's winning. It's winning for black.
Right.
Let's say I play the wrong move and we reach. Let me just make a couple. How do I do this? Let me make some random moves. Like, let's say you were to reach this position, for example, and it's black's move. Now it's losing because white will capture.
Yeah, right. Black has to move into a position where white can capture the pawn, yeah.
And then white moves the king, and white makes a queen as well.
Yep. So this is zugzwang.
Zugzwang is, Zugzwang is a position where, depending on whose move it is, they lose the game. They can't just wait. They would like to just wait and not make a move. But Zugzwang is where whoever's turn is and they have to make a move. It's Zugzwang because they have to make a move and lose the game.
I think when I play, I'm permanently in zugzwang. I prefer not to make any moves and just let my opponent make a move. That's like my approach generally.
Right. So like this in end games, it really it's one of those things that matters a lot.
Right.
So all right. So I think you've looked at a lot of these we've looked at enough of these king and pawn end games. So let me start a new board. 1 second. So yeah, when I do this, I'm taking a file from chess software and then loading it onto chess.com. We have what are called PGN files. Right. So I'm just literally taking it straight out of the chess software because that's the easiest way to do it. And there's only been one bit of chess software for a very long time now.
Do you have notes about players that would be offensive if they were to be public?
No, I mean, I think certainly chess is a game where when you get really good at it, there's a lot of ego in it. You have to really think that you're better than your opponents. So I wouldn't say it's in the notes, but I think all players at certain times, we have certain opinions about the people we're playing against that are not exactly fantastic, not exactly politically correct.
Got it.
So, all right. So you see this position. This is white has a rook and 4 pawns. Black has a rook and 3 pawns.
Yep.
So one thing that you want to do is like this end game, it's not necessarily about knowing the exact pattern to win, but one thing that's important to think about is the rooks here. And when you're in a rook and pawn end game and you have like an extra pawn, this is what we call a pass pawn, by the way. I don't know if I explained that, but a pass pawn is where there's nothing impeding the progress of the pawn.
Got it. Oh yeah, that I know.
So like if you look at these 3 pawns, none of these are pass pawns because there's a pawn in the way. But this is a pass pawn that if it could, it would just go all the way up the board and make a queen. Mm-hmm. So when you have rooks on the board in a position like this, and you're trying to sort of get this pawn up the board, the most important thing to remember is where do you want your rook to help escort the pawn up the board?
Okay, so I mean, I guess I would first think about rook to a1. Mm-hmm. And then I would try to move the pawn up, and then I guess the black rook could... I guess you would need the king, right? Black would need to bring the king in if they want a shot at stopping me.
Right. So let's say that you make a check and you try to promote the pawn like this.
Yep.
And I go rook here.
Yep.
Is this a good setup for the rook escorting the pawn up the board or not?
It seems like it's not, because at some point I have to get the rook out of the way. The rook can't attack diagonally, so at some point it seems the pawn will be unprotected.
Right. So, for example, I just keep waiting, and if you ever move the rook out of the way, I take the pawn.
Right.
So your rook becomes a very passive piece. It can't move here.
And I have no other check or anything that I could do.
Right. So you were right at the start, but I just wanted to show why that is. So if you have a position like this, it's always better if you can get the rook behind the pawn rather than having the rook in front of the pawn or having the rook on the side. Like even a position like this is not fantastic because you can't really move the rook up to keep escorting the pawn up the board and make it queen.
Right.
Because if you ever move the rook up, I just take the pawn.
That makes sense.
So what you want to do here is, you want to go rook here. And the reason that this is so powerful is because now I can't get the rook behind the pawn. In a perfect world for black, you always want to attack this pawn from behind rather than from in front. So for example, it's always better that it's behind the pawn like here than say if you have the rook than the rook in front of the pawn.
And why is that? Just because I can defend by putting my rook behind?
Yes, because what happens is when you let me go back, is that when you put the rook on a1, what happens here? Like, let's just say I move my king.
I think I just start moving the pawn.
Right, and so if you were black, how do you stop the pawn from coming all the way up the board here?
I mean, I guess you go here.
Right. So that's the only way to stop the pawn. But the problem is that now once you push the pawn all the way up the board, the rook is stuck here.
Yep.
So basically, the black rook is stuck, and the white rook always guards the pawn. So again, conceptually, if you want to help get this pawn to the end of the board and make a queen, how would you do that? Because you can't really move the rook or the pawn anymore.
Well, the pawns only go forward, so I guess it has to be something with the king, right?
So so this isn't about specific moves. Where would you like your king to be if you could get it to a certain square?
Here?
Exactly. Yeah, that's perfect. So like in a perfect world, if I just keep waiting around, you would just bring the king up, and at some point the rook has to give itself up. You're going to push the queen and capture the rook, or you're just going to get another queen.
Now, could it become a king race to get up to this square if the black king, instead of moving back and forth, was trying to race me over there?
Right, and that's what it should become. So after rook a1 here, the first thing black should do is black should move the rook here. And the reason is that when you push the pawn, I stop the pawn on this square rather than the 7th rank.
It's closer to the king in some sense?
Yes, but it's also further away from the queening square. Like the further up the board the pawn gets, the harder it becomes to defend this position.
Yeah.
So now you don't really want to move the pawn or the rook.
So now I guess you go with the king.
Right. Right. And so now I'm going to just move my king over.
Okay.
I'm going to move my king here. And now, okay, this is to advance this next move. So I'm not really going to expect you to play this move, but what you do here is you can play a waiting move with your rook.
Right.
And so now what happens when I bring my king over? Because I'm threatening to capture this pawn, right?
Yep.
But can you prevent that?
Can I prevent it? Okay, so is it just another one square rook move? No, it doesn't really help.
Right. So what happens here, now that the king has gone over towards this pawn, you can bring your king closer. Because what happens when black captures?
Well, I guess if we trade here, now I've got access to these pawns, and the black king is too far from my pawns.
Right. It's 1, 2, 3, and I need 1, 2, 3, 4, like 5 moves.
Yep.
So your king gets over and captures all these pawns immediately.
Right.
So that's how you would win this game, is basically when you get an active rook and your opponent has a passive rook like this, your opponent's going to have to bring their king close to the pawn, because when you bring your king close, if you get the king next to the pawn, then the pawn's going all the way up the board immediately. And so when your opponent brings the king all the way over, then you now use your king and you go the other way towards black's pawns. And
so the idea basically is try to get my rook behind the passed pawn, force black to have to defend with the rook, start bringing my king in, and then if black's king gets overextended, then I
go the
kind of concede the rook trade and move the king where I'm going to want it after that trade.
Right, exactly. Because basically it comes down to, think of it this way, think of the active rook versus the passive rook. So like if your rook ends up like in front of the pawn, your rook is very passive because it can't move away. It only can move up and down. But the black rook, meanwhile, can attack the pawn, but it can also attack sideways as well. You see how like the black rook is very active.
Totally.
It's not just stuck here. It's attacking vertically and also horizontally. So whereas the white rook is just like, it's passive because it's basically stuck to these 3 squares guarding the pawn.
Yes.
So when you put the rook behind the pawn, it might look like your rook is passive, but you actually make black's rook have to become very passive and stuck behind the pawn here where it can't move. So your rook actually can still go side to side. Like if the king comes close, there might be some ideas to check the king even. But the black rook is very passive here, whereas if the rook can get behind the pawn like on a2 here, then black's rook is very active and your rook becomes passive.
Sure, that makes sense.
So yeah, I think that's that's the main thing about this endgame, is that when you get to the rook and pawn, like rook and pawn endgames, if you have an extra pawn that's active, or you have a passive pawn, or you can get the rook behind the pawn, it's always good if you can make your opponent's rook become passive and your rook be active.
So generally, in a situation where it's a rook on each side and 4 versus 3 pawns, is it always winnable for the side that has the 4 pawns, or can you have a situation where it would not be because of the placement?
So most rook and pawn endgames where you have only rooks and you only have pawns, it's probably a draw with correct play the vast majority of the time. If you cannot get something like this with the rook on a1 where it's going to escort the pawn all the way up the board.
Even if you have one additional pawn,
Correct.
it would end up as a
Correct.
draw. Okay.
So normally rook and pawn endgames are drawn. Now, for example, let me just make a couple. Ignore my moves here. Let me. Make
I mean, to be
random.
perfectly frank, in the tournament, I don't know that there's going to be perfect play. That
No,
I
there
mean,
won't be. No,
yeah.
I'm just explaining a general thing. Like
Right. No, and yeah.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think it also makes sense for me to have some strategy against what are the likely mistakes that an opponent would make trying to defend this position.
Mm-hmm. Right. So that's why, like, this specific example probably won't occur, but it's very likely you could get into a game where there are ideas like you want to use the rook to help push the pawn up the board.
Yeah.
You end up in those king and pawn end games where you're trying the opposition matters.
Makes
like
sense.
this rook a1 idea is something that probably will occur at some point during the event. Whether you spot it or not, it's unclear, but just knowing the idea is the reason I'm showing you this.
And are these moves only relevant when really there's very little else left on the board? Like if there were some knights still on the board or a bishop and I mean, it's a totally different situation.
Right. Agreed. Yes.
Yeah.
It's definitely different. This is very specific to when there are only rooks on the board.
Got it.
Okay. Let me pull up another one. So do you know about the rooks on the 7th rank? Like double rooks on the 7th? Have you heard that phrase?
I've heard it. I don't. It's not hugely relevant to my skill level yet.
Okay. Well, I guess let me invite you to this board.
I would like it to be relevant. Let me put it that way.
Okay. Okay. So doubled rooks on the 7th means when you have rooks like this that are on the 7th rank and they're connected.
I've lost to this many times.
Ah, okay. That's kind of surprising because I wouldn't think this happens that often. So normally it really doesn't matter even like how many pieces are on the board. If you can get like 2 rooks that are connected on the 7th rank and your opponent's king is on this 8th rank, it's generally very deadly, if not outright winning all the time.
Okay.
So this position that I put up is actually from one of my games. I reversed the colors, but I had this position in an actual game. And so let me just blunder my. I'm just gonna make some random.
Should I be looking at this from white or black's perspective?
From white's perspective.
Okay.
Let me just make some moves. So you know how to make the checkmate in this position, right?
Let's see.
With
I
the
mean,
two rooks?
so yeah. I mean, I guess the king in the middle is what's making me doubt the first move. I think this way.
Okay. So now the king can't come back towards the center, right?
Right.
So when I go here. Right, and when I go here, yeah, beautiful, easy checkmate with the 2 rooks. I don't know what you want to call this pattern, but you know the pattern. That's all that really matters. So, okay, let's go back to start. So this is the position I had from a game, and I know chat is saying rook c7, rook d7 wins. It's not white's move. Thank you very much, chat. But thank you for the suggestion. So now, what would you like to do to win this game? Like, let's just say I move the rook here. Ideally, how would you like to checkmate this black king? Where it can't move.
Is it to move it in this direction towards the H file?
Well, how would you try to make a checkmate with the 2 rooks? So you want to basically use the rooks to checkmate the king. It's the exact same pattern that you just saw.
Right.
So how would you try to do that with the 2 rooks? You could do that move, but there's a better move. Because if you move the rook, I just move my king over, and you can't check, right? Because I take.
Oh, right.
So how would you try to do that? To make this the same checkmate with the rooks.
Maybe rook here?
Yeah, perfect. And so now the problem is that it's very hard for me to stop the checkmate because the rooks are too far away. Your king can't move 3 squares. And so black can play like rook here, for example, and the game goes on. But you see the idea.
Yes.
So now I'm going to move my knight here.
Okay, so if I move here, then there's this. Or no, that wouldn't really bother me.
So, okay, let's say I move the rook here. What black can play is black can play check.
Yep.
And so now when you move the king, what I can do here is I can move my knight back.
Right.
And so now you actually can't capture the knight because my rook guards the knight.
Yep.
But much more importantly, my king can now cross. It can now come up because the knight shields. It covers this 7th rank.
Yep.
And this actually would be a draw, by the way.
At this point, this is a draw.
Right, because there's 2 rooks against a rook and a knight. So if you think about the end game, if you end up with a rook against a bishop, or a rook against a knight, just a lone rook against a bishop or a lone rook against a knight, it's a draw.
Okay.
Now that's not to say it would be drawn in PogChamps, but it is a known drawn endgame. And so the same would apply to this endgame with the 2 rooks against the rook and the knight. Like this would be a draw here. Or if it was a rook and a bishop, it would be a draw. But when we look at this position after black moves the knight, there's actually a very neat idea here to win the game. And the idea here is that basically, I'm trying to think what you would call this technique, but you can make this check here.
Okay.
And black goes king over. And so you see how in this position, if you move the rook over here, for example, black could always move the king over 1 square, right?
Yep.
And just stop the checkmate.
Yep.
So what you can do here is you can make the check. The king has to go here, and you can go rook here. And so it's like you force the king to the center. This king has to go this way, and now there's no way you can get to this corner here. This
yep.
square. And so let's say I just move my rook here.
That's interesting. I mean, would I want to?
Let me just make a random move. I'm going to move my king here. So now, how would you try to checkmate the king?
Do I want to move this way?
So if you go that way, I go king here.
Okay.
And now you can't make the checkmate, right?
Yep.
So what's another square you can go to?
What about here and attack the knight in the meantime?
Also good. And if I move my king over, you could take the knight.
Yeah.
But what I was actually looking for was not so much this move to try and win the knight, but that you can actually move the rook further. You can split the rooks.
Okay.
And so now you see the king can't get over to either side. So wherever the king goes, you're getting checkmated.
Yep.
So like if we go back to the start here, like when I go knight here, if you ever go this way, my king gets over to the side where you can't make the checkmate. And then when you come over, I just go back.
Yep.
So what you do is you actually make the check, and when the king gets here, you can split the rooks. You can go rook here first, because you have the idea of moving the rook next move, and then making the back rank checkmate from either side.
Makes sense.
This is a very advanced concept in terms of knowing to check and then moving the rook over, because normally what you think of is like you want to you just want to move the rook and try to checkmate right away.
Yeah.
But what you do by making this check is you play this delayed move. You kick the king 1 square away so it can't get over to the corner, and then you split the rooks. You go rook g7, and then you checkmate from either side.
And there's nothing black could do to stop that?
Black can give up material to make the game go on for more moves, but no, there's no way to stop it.
Okay.
Because how would you try to stop it?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, I don't even know at this point. So I don't know if black goes here to prevent that rook from eventually getting there. But then you just trade rooks on that square. No, you wouldn't want to do that.
No. I would not go over. I would just go here.
Okay.
I don't have to go all the way over. I just need to make sure that wherever I split the rooks, that the king can't get to one of these squares.
To either of them, yeah.
Right. And now I can't stop the checkmate. You can checkmate from either side because both rooks cover this rank.
Makes sense.
So it's just winning. And this one isn't really so much about. It's not so much about remembering this technique, because the technique is very hard, but it's more about remembering that if you can get these rooks doubled on the 7th rank with a king on the 8th rank, it's very, very dangerous. And then you can always move the rooks apart and then make the checkmate on this 8th rank.
And with the knight being able to check the king on multiple squares, I'd also want to be making sure I don't get stuck in a fork, right?
Right. So for example, if I move my rook down and you go rook here, I can go here.
Yeah.
And fork your king and your rook.
Right.
And at the start, it's the same thing. So when I had this position in the game that I played, like a serious professional game against a very strong Israeli Grandmaster, the reason they moved the knight here was because they thought they had 2 forks in the position. They saw this fork, and they also saw this fork as well.
Right.
So there are 2 forks here. But the reason it doesn't work is because, again, like I said, I make the check, I split the rooks, you have no check here, and then I'm free to move the rook over and make the checkmate on the 8th rank next move.
Got it.
So mainly it's about remembering this notion of like if you can get these double rooks on the seventh to attack, to not to attack, to make the checkmate.
And this is when the king is on the 8th.
Right. If you can get the double rooks, and it's the same thing, by the way. For example, it was on the second rank. If you were black and you two rooks, it still would be called the seventh rank.
Okay.
So it's whenever the rooks are on this rank right in front of the king, and the king is on the back line. It's called doubled rooks on the seventh, and that's very it's very powerful. It's not always winning, but if you get the doubled rooks, it's very strong. Just like in general, and this isn't about end games, but let's say, let me just make some random moves. If you get rooks like this, even if you get double rooks on a file, it's also very strong in middle games. Like when there are a lot of pieces on the board, if there's an open line and you can double your rooks on the open line, it's very strong.
Got it.
And just for my chat, since a couple of people are being silly and they feel like thinking they're geniuses. After knight to 6, folks, there's rook d7 check, hitting the king and the knight. Black moves the king, and you go rook takes knight. And thank you very much. Game over. Much appreciated. So there is no way to stop the checkmate per se. You just lose material and you resign a few moves later. But mainly, yeah, it's just like knowing that if you get the double rooks on the 7th like this, it's very strong when there's a king on the back rank.
Got it.
Okay, so let's see. Are you following some of this?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, this right here is much less likely, I think, to become usable in one of my upcoming games than the previous ones, which seem more likely to come up. But like you said, this is a tougher thing than, yeah.
No, I would definitely agree with that. So let me see. Okay, let's do. Okay, there's this position. Let me pull this up. So now I'm going to show you this one, which is this is a rook and pawn endgame. Again, it feels very simple, but this is another endgame that I think could occur potentially, or something similar to this. So this is, let me invite you to the board. Okay, so this is a position where black has a rook and a pawn versus a rook, and the king is very close to the black pawn. So it's white's move here, and there's this technique which is called the Philidor technique. It's a forced, it's a drawing sequence where your opponent cannot win the game if you know the correct moves to play. This was discovered, I think, in probably about the 1760s in France. This technique. So what black wants to do in a perfect world is, let's just say, I'm going to set this up differently here. So let's say we get this position.
Okay.
Black's trying to push the pawn and make a queen again, as always. So I'm going to go rook here. Black can go, let's just say rook here. You move rook here. Black makes a check. And what happens when the king comes over?
What happens when the king comes over? I lose the rook.
Try to create, right.
I guess this, and then I've got to move, and then I lose the rook.
Right, so when I move the king, you just take the rook.
Yeah.
So black wants to keep pushing the pawn and the king, and then use the rook to win the game.
Yep.
So this technique that's called the Philidor technique, this leads to a draw, is you play rook here. So you see how there's going to be one rank between, when black pushes the pawn, there's going to be this one rank between the kings.
Yep.
So when you push the rook up, black cannot bring the king forward because the rook covers all the squares. And
yes.
So now when black pushes the pawn forward, he wants to bring the king ahead.
And I can stop that by moving my king?
Well, if you move the king, what happens here is I'm going to check you.
Yes.
And when you move the king, I can bring my king down.
Okay.
Me.
Yep.
So when you play rook here, the moment black pushes the pawn to help advance the king, you can now, again, this is, again, the technique is the same as the other end game. It's not the exact position, but what do you want to do with the rook? How best do you try to attack the pawn of the king?
Let's see. I want to attack, if I'm a white, I want to attack from behind.
Yeah.
Love it.
Right. So how would you do that?
I guess maybe here. No, that's actually that's probably too close to the king. I wouldn't want to do that. Mm-hmm. Maybe further. I don't know. Back here.
Right.
So now here.
Mm-hmm. Right. You could do that, but actually, what you can also do is you can make the check.
Okay.
because what happens is okay. So let's go back here. Let's say I block with the rook.
Yep.
In this position, you would actually trade the rooks.
Okay.
So how would you draw this with white?
I don't know. I mean, maybe here.
And so when I go here, right, you keep the king opposite the pawn.
Yeah.
And so when I go king here,
stay opposite the king.
Right, and when I push,
back here.
Right, and it's a draw. It's a stalemate. So I can't trade the rooks because then it leads to a draw. But when I move the king, you just start checking me all over the board.
Mm-hmm.
Like when I go here, you check. And whenever I block with the rook, you can always just trade, and we reach this end game, which is always a draw. So like in this position, when you put the rook here, if black ever pushes the pawn, you go behind and you start making all of the checks.
Yep.
And black can't really do anything else because if black ever checks, you just move the king. And if black just waits, you just keep waiting all day long on this third rank. And the moment black pushes the pawn to where there's only this one rank in between, then you go behind and you start making all the checks with the rook.
Okay. And if the rook at any point checks me, then I go to the second rank.
Right. You have to go to the second rank. Yeah, you just keep the king on one of these two squares, either opposite the king or opposite the pawn.
Got it.
So mainly it's just, remember that the active rook is very, very important in these end games.
Wow.
Does that make sense?
It does, yeah.
Okay. Okay, let's do this is a little bit of a simpler one. Kind of. This is very conceptual, and this won't probably... I mean, most of these rook and pawn endgames probably won't occur, but it's not so much about like knowing the exact technique, but remembering what the concept is, because the concept will be important at some point in the event.
Got it.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so in this position, white has a rook and two pawns, and black has a rook. So if black moves the... well, let me just make a random move. Let's say black moves the rook up to attack the pawn.
Yeah.
Are there any good moves here?
Okay, let's see. So I guess I would think about either, in no particular order, h7, rook to a8 check, forcing the king to the 7th rank. Mm-hmm. And then when the king has to go... I guess, would the king have to go back to the 8th rank in that case?
So look at these pawns. What squares do these pawns cover here?
These pawns cover these 3 squares.
Right. So the king can't come up, can it?
Oh, right. Okay. Okay, so if I play here,
right,
then the rook has to block.
Mm-hmm.
And then I take the rook.
Right. And so that's the end of the game.
Got it.
So in this position, the rook can never leave this last rank because then you move up and you make the check.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to wait with my rook over here. Now, the way that you would win this game, let me start with the first move, which makes sense, which is move the rook up here to guard the pawn. So there's never any idea of the black bringing the king over to win the pawns.
Right.
So I'm going to move my rook here. So how would you, in a perfect world, if you could, trade the rooks here? Because you have 2 pawns. If you have 2 pawns against the king, I would just say that's all. Let's just assume that's always winning. If you can reach king and 2 pawns versus the king.
How would I trade the rook?
How would you try to trade the rooks? Because my rook can't come off the back rank, because then I'm always getting checkmated.
I guess I start moving the king over.
Okay.
Maybe.
Well, I'm looking for a concept. Like, it's not so much about one move is better than another move. And also, when you reach end games, the moves don't have to be super precise. You just have to have a concept in mind. Because normally, with so few pieces, your opponent can't do a whole lot.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I start moving the king over. If at any point the rook comes off of the 8th rank, then I've got that check on, and then I kind of am forcing that previous position we looked at.
Right. So how would you try to trade the rooks? Because my rook can't come
this
off
is the first move.
Sure. Yeah. Like I said, it's not about one move. You just have to come up with a concept to try and trade the rooks. Okay.
Now let me think. Here.
Well, you can't come up because I'm going
to... Oh, right. Yeah, right.
Okay.
Now here?
Let's go here.
Okay, so to force the trade, maybe I come over here.
Right. This is the idea is correct. But the problem with coming over here is I can actually just check your king.
Ah.
So there's a better move that you can play here to try and exchange the rooks. It doesn't always have to be on this specific square.
Oh, okay. Maybe here.
Also good. But again, I can check your king.
Okay. Am I trying to avoid a king check there?
It's not so
rook
much
check?
that you want to avoid the check because you can still win, but there's a move where I cannot avoid the trade of the rooks. So you want to exchange a rook on the 8th rank here.
Yep. Here?
Right. And so what happens when I check now? Right. And you see if I trade the rooks, that's what you want. That's what you want. But if I go like here, your next move would be right. And if I go here, right. So now I'm going to trade. And so let's see if you can win this end game.
Okay, so let's think about this. If I play here, you could come to this square. So I think here. Now let me think. Could you take that? You could. Do I play a waiting move? And then... Oh, I think maybe this?
Well, but now it'll take the pawn.
Oh,
Remember,
right. No, that's no good.
Support each other.
Yeah.
And when you have two pawns that support like this, like remember always that the backwards pawn here doesn't matter as much. It's only as long as this pawn, which is one square from queening, is protected. That's what's most important.
So if I move my king closer, is it this way?
Okay, and now I go here. Right, and so now when I take the pawn.
Right. And then it was...
Right. Right, and checkmate. Exactly.
Yep.
That's perfect. So yeah, basically the point behind me showing you this end game is that like when you have something like this, there are many ways to win this, but just looking for the easiest path where your opponent can't prevent the exchange of the rooks, where you transpose it into an end game that you know you'll win 100 times out of 100 times.
That concept makes sense.
So like when you just think of it this way, if you have two pawns against the king, pretty much no matter what, that's going to be a winning end game. Like almost no matter what. I don't actually have this one. Let me do a new position setup of that, since that did occur to me just now. Okay, let's do this. Okay, let's this. Okay, so I'm gonna set up another one. This is should be king and two pawns against a king. Let me invite you to this one.
Got it.
Okay, so this is a position where you have a king and two pawns against a king, right?
Yes.
Now, if you only now ordinarily you're going to assume it's not easy to win this end game because your pawns are doubled. If your pawns were just on different, like you had one pawn here on this square right next to it, and your pawns were not one in front of the other or stacked like this, it would be very easy to win. But in this case, it's not. So what would your move be here if you're trying to progress forward and attack?
I guess I would start moving the king forward in order to push the black king back and kind of keep making progress.
Right.
But I'd want to be careful to avoid eventually a draw.
Right.
Because at a certain point, if the two pawns get separated, isn't it just the previous draw scenario?
Well, yeah. If you were to lose one of the pawns, it is. So how would you try to escort the pawns up the board here? Like,
okay,
you'd actually like to put your king where your pawn is, and then we reach that opposition again. But you can't do that.
So maybe this is the first move?
Okay. So now I'm going to go here.
So maybe now I play this pawn.
Okay, this is actually winning, but let's see. So I go king here. Yeah, good game. Thanks for the draw. The black king can't move.
Ah, so it's stalemate.
Right. Whereas if there's no pawn, you just use the king and the pawn and you win the game.
Right.
So what you can
So
actually
maybe so what was the right so here was this the move?
now I go here.
Okay. And then I lose a pawn.
Right. So actually the way you would win here is you would actually push this pawn.
Oh, okay. And if you take it, then it just becomes this other endgame.
What's your next move?
Okay, now opposition?
Right, and now it's black's move, not white's move.
Yes.
So I have to move my king, and your king comes up.
Yep.
So this would be winning, but the simplest way here is when I go this way, you can actually go king here.
Okay.
And now if I go here, what's your next move?
Now I push the pawn.
You actually move the king over.
Oh, okay, okay.
Because it doesn't matter if you have one or two pawns here.
Same concept.
It's the same thing. Whichever way my king goes, you move the king up the board and then back over. You make this I don't know, it's like square, triangle, whatever. But basically, yeah, you move the king, which the opposite way of the black king.
Got it.
So here, what I would actually play is I would go here. I would try to keep the opposition.
And then now I would play the pawn.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that I don't want to come here, right? Oh, wait, no.
Well,
or do
think
I?
of it this way. So let's think. The original position with the king and pawn versus king, this would be a draw, right? If you only have one pawn.
Yep.
Why would this be a draw at the end of the day? Like if you only have the king and the pawn, forget about this one pawn. Why is it a draw? What happens at the end of the board?
The king can't move and I can't make a queen.
Right, so it's stalemate.
Yeah.
Okay, but now think of it this way. Now you have this pawn here.
Yeah.
So you actually can do that. You can do the same. You can do that. So let's see if you can figure out why. So try to play it out and figure out why it's not a draw at the end. So.
Okay.
Right. So just force my king to the end of the board. You can do that, but actually, I just want you to go here.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now I'll go here, keep the king opposite the pawn. Right, so I'll go here. Mm-hmm, so now I go here.
Okay, so now do I start pushing this other pawn? Is that useful at this point? No. I mean, I guess here?
But that's a draw.
Oh, right, yeah.
No, the difference is here you can push the pawn.
Now I can push the pawn, okay.
So you can push the pawn one or two squares, it doesn't matter. But what happens is now I have to move my king.
Right. And I can just keep moving the second pawn.
Well, no, that's not what you want to do. You want to go
Oh, I see.
And you make a queen.
Got it.
So like that's the point. Is if you forget about this pawn, assume it's not on the board, it's a draw because you have to move the king. If you move the king back, I just take the pawn.
Right.
And if I move the king, it's a draw. So when you have this extra pawn, even though it's a double pawn, it's very important because usually when you push the pawn all the way down the board, you can then like waste a move. You can push this pawn so that the king has to move, and then you move your king up and make a queen.
Crystal clear.
Somewhat, yeah, somewhat. Yeah, I mean, I don't really want to overload too much, so I think that's probably a pretty good spot to stop with the end games. But like, do you have like specific questions like about these end games or in general?
No, I mean, with these, I think it's just repetition and really getting down the patterns, and then keeping in mind that I have to add to the position whether it's my turn or my opponent's turn, and that actually changes the scenario.
Right. That it's very important. But I think it's most important. Just like the concepts, like remembering, like when you reach these end games, like if you end up with these two pawns, like even though you think the pawn here on b2 doesn't matter much, it does because you can sort of like waste the tempos and force the king to go where it doesn't want to go here.
Right.
And so like this one with like using the pawn, or the other one where you're trying to exchange the rooks or the king opposition, I think I would say that rook a1, especially the rook in 4 versus the rook in 3, that's the one concept that's going to be most important to remember for the event, because that's the one that's most likely to occur. Some of these king and pawn end games could occur, but probably you're not going to get it where it's a simplified version, because in order for it to be relatively close like this, players have to be the same level. Because otherwise someone's going to be up like 5 pawns in this end game and just a straightforward win. But I think that's important. And then also the double rooks one. Remembering that if you can double the rooks with the king on the back rank, that's almost always deadly. It's
Then you
almost
split
always
them.
winning for you.
Then you split them.
Right, and then you make that checkmate,
Yeah.
the separate rooks. So I think it's. I mean, I think you're on a great path. You've definitely looked at openings. You have good general understanding. I think across all phases of the game, but just repeating a little bit. I think some of these basic end games will also be very helpful because when you're going to make it into to keep it real, you're going to be in the champions bracket. Like you're one of the.
I am not. I listen. I wish I was as confident as Trump is that he's going to lose, and I wish I was as confident as you are that I'm going to be in this champions bracket.
Okay. At any rate, you're going to play against players who are around your level at some point, and so
Right.
some of these even positions, you'll get these even material positions deeper in the game as opposed to at the very start. So
Got it.
So that's why I think these concepts should be important.
Is your sense that the level of the players in the tournament is relatively even?
For the most part, yes. I think there are a couple players who need to work really, really hard to catch up. But overall, I feel that I would say you're one of the favorites. There are probably about like 5 to 6 people who are working quite diligently. And then some players who have to work harder. But you're definitely in that, like, I would say the top 4 to 5 for sure.
And it's 16 total?
16 total. 8 players. There are 8 players who go into the top bracket and 8 players who go into the bottom bracket.
Right.
And the top 2 from each group make it in. So it'll be 4 groups of 4 players. Top 2 in groups A, B, C, D make it in the championship bracket, and then 3rd and 4th go into the bottom bracket.
And are all 16 players have been announced, right?
Yes, I announced them earlier on the stream. Most had already been announced, but the last 2 were announced on stream.
Oh, there were new. Who was announced today? Oh, I don't even know then.
Forsen was announced, and I believe the other one was Call Me Carson.
Oh my God, I don't know who any of these people are. I feel like I'm completely out culturally of what's happening.
I don't know. I mean, like they're big streamers, but again, they're just streamers.
Okay, I don't want anybody taking offense. I mean, I'm sure they don't know who I am either. You know what I mean? Like, it's all fine. It's no big deal.
Yeah.
Everybody's cool.
I think it's like there always are some people who know each other, some who don't. But like it's all good. I think it's just like everyone's trying to learn the game and have fun, and I think that's what counts. I know from like being on Twitch the last like 2 years, it's amazing to see all the different categories and what everyone is doing, and it's great to see so many people from different backgrounds. So it's not like there's you, for example, and like Hassan and like and Destiny and all the political guys. It's like it's this nice mix from like all these different games and categories.
Yeah, Stephen Kenneth Destiny Bennell II would be an interesting player in the tournament.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like your politics and the way you explain things is a little bit better, honestly. Like,
really? Oh my God, clip that. Jeez, holy
but
shit. We've got to clip that.
Just saying.
That's shocking.
Just saying. Yeah, he is actually quite decent at chess, but I like your politics more.
Wow, I'm flattered. Oh my God, that's going to be in the new David Pakman show trailer.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to lean left anyway, so I like what I see.
Hey, so one thing I wanted to ask you about, completely out of context, at some point I came across a video it was a video actually of a different game at a tournament, and you just happened to be sitting next to the game that was going on, and you're like giving this side eye to something that's going on and just looking over at some other player who I didn't recognize, like they had committed a crime of some kind. What was the story with that? I'm just not good enough at chess to know what happened that was so offensive.
So it's not even that it was offensive. So just so my chat knows, there's this tournament that I played in Gibraltar. I think it was last year. And the guy who was playing on the board next to me, he was formerly the number 2 ranked player in the world. He's an extremely strong super grandmaster. And he was playing against a player who's a little bit weaker. Obviously, the guy's still another extremely strong grandmaster, but someone who most people would not say is in the same category as he is. And basically, the guy that I'm sitting next to, the former world number 2, he played an opening that was dubious. He basically made a sacrifice that was not sound. He sacrificed a knight, I think it was, when he shouldn't have, and so he was completely losing in the game. Okay. And the reason I gave that look is because having known the guy for so many years and having played against him in many events, I have a lot of respect for him. I think he's one of the best players in the world. And so to see him playing like that is just one of those things where it's like, dude, what are you doing? Like, you're such a great player. And I look over and he's just losing this game terribly.
And had you been watching the game the whole time as you were playing, or did you look and see the position and identify that it was wacky?
Yeah, so one thing that chess players do is when you play these long games of chess, you have long periods where your opponent's thinking because you can think like 20 or 30 minutes on a move. And so periodically you're looking at the board next to you, or you get up and you look at the other board. So you're always sort of paying attention because in the modern age with technology, you're looking to see what sort of opening strategies people are playing. And so I was watching the game on and off, and then at some point there was a period when I was thinking at my board for probably 20, 25 minutes. And then I looked over again, and it's like the position had gone from something that I thought was interesting, just kind of normal, to something that was terribly losing for this guy I know. So
And is it considered crass or rude to be caught looking like that over at another board, or is it just sort of like no big deal in the chess community?
It's not really a big deal. I think it's, I mean, perhaps it was a little bit more exaggerated than it should have been, but there are definitely times when top grandmasters, they look at games and they will definitely give some people these looks like, what are you doing? There's this Dutch grandmaster, for example, I know, who very frequently, when he sees somebody play an opening that he doesn't think is good or he doesn't have respect for it, he will sort of give this stare. So it is pretty common to have some expressions and mannerisms when people do things that you aren't expecting.
I gotcha. Okay, that's good to know. Yeah, that's a wild moment out of context. If you don't know what's going on, it's it's like something strange clearly is happening here.
Right. Yeah. It's basically like, it's like, as my chat said, it's really, bro, what are you doing? Like, you just don't expect it because the top players are so consistent and they generally play such great chess that it's just surprising when you see it happen. I was shocked.
I was shocked that you were so shocked. Let me put it that way. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it's like, to give some context, the guy who made the blunder, the former world number 2, I've probably known him for, I would say, 20 years or thereabouts. So I've been very familiar. I've seen his games from the time he was a young junior player to becoming a professional, an adult. So like when you have such respect and you've seen so many games players have played over such a long career, they're just, sometimes you see these things and it's like, well, if they do this, why can't they do that against me? Or, well, like, what's going on?
My only other real question, chess related, was what is it? I've been watching a little bit of, is it Anish or Anish Giri?
Mm-hmm.
Something about his personality on these streams is extremely compelling. Like, I find it strangely entertaining. And it's not where you see him and you're like, he would be the most fun person to have a beer with. It's not that type of thing, but it's like something about his demeanor is strangely compelling.
Interesting. Yeah, I think Anish is very charismatic. He's certainly one of the guys who has more charisma, I would say, in the chess world. He's one of the guys who can say things that are more sort of off the cuff. He can be very entertaining. And I think in the chess world, it's fairly rare to have people who are entertaining and can sort of like put context or give some perspective on a lot of different things. And just the way that he handles social media, for example, is not common either. Like, he's very brash. He writes a lot of sort of what's the way of putting it? He writes a lot of sort of messages that generate like responses. It's very like sort of out there and in your face. So he's one of the people who's most fun to watch for sure in the chess world.
Obviously, English isn't his first language, but like, what are the rules about that at tournaments? Because I remember some controversy about it. I don't remember who it was. Said Magnus said something in Norwegian, and then it was like, had that been true, are there rules where it's like the tournament says this is the default language, or is it just English?
I mean, pretty much everybody speaks English for the most part. Like, not even as a first language, but I think people plenty of times have cursed in other languages, but generally everybody speaks English. So like, if you talk to people, I would say it's probably like, I would say 80% of people speak English. And then probably, I don't know, probably like a large percentage, I want to say like maybe 70%, they'll either speak English or they'll speak Russian. Those are by far and away the two most popular languages.
But is it a written rule that it's English only at the chessboards or something like that?
I mean, you're not supposed to. You're not really supposed to talk during the game.
At all? Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's just, That I mean, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but generally you aren't supposed to talk.
I didn't realize that. I guess that makes sense because it's like, what would you really talk about during the game?
Right, because you're trying to focus and beat your opponent.
Yeah.
But yeah, also in terms of that specific story though, the reason that it became an issue is because both players were very low on time. So when someone says something, it can be very distracting since you're not
Right.
supposed to talk. And since it was a blitz game between Magnus and a very young junior player from Iran, it was just one of those things that you're not really expecting. So when it happened, it kind of caused a little bit of controversy.
Have you, I don't, if you just want to pass on this, by all means, but have you taken a position on, remind me the name of the young Iranian player?
His name is Ali Reza Farouja.
Right. Have you taken a position on his decision to essentially be French, play as a French player in order to not be bound by these Iranian rules about not playing with Israeli players?
Yeah, I think there are a couple things I will say. There are quite a few Iranians I know who have actually left the country for many reasons. There are several female players that I've spoken to over the years who have left because of the issue with the hijab, and Ali Reza leaving as well because of the issue with trying to improve and play against Israeli players. So what I would say in general terms on the topic is that when you're young and you're trying to improve and play the game of chess, you really you want the most opportunities to just get out there and play the game, play against everybody, play against the best competition. And when you have these rules that the basically the Iranian government has instituted where you are not able to compete against Israelis, whether it's chess, whether it's martial arts, Olympic sports, and all these other different activities, um, it sort of it makes it very difficult because then like in chess where you don't have all the opportunities, you really need invitations to tournaments. Organizers are not necessarily going to invite players if they're playing for Iran because it causes controversy, and there are quite a few very strong Israeli players as well. And so it's just one of those situations which is very unfortunate. But in terms of Ali Reza, he's one of the most talented junior players that we've seen in a very long time. And for him to come out of a country like Iran, which they do try to support chess, but they don't have a really strong chess background or culture. To have players coming out of that country who are so strong, who are potentially going to compete for the world championship, um, it's again you want to have the most opportunities. So it's a shame that things like this happen. But again, I know quite a few people who have left the country. And I feel like I try not to be political, but I think certainly there's a bit of a brain drain going on there, and a lot of people have been forced to leave the country, and it's really a shame. It's a great tragedy.
It is. It is. Yeah. It's quite a situation. Made some headlines even in
Yeah,
my
like
world.
not even to use that example, but there's someone else I know and who I'm friends with, and I saw a post that they made, and it's someone she's female, and she made a post, and it was a joke, but she made the post that if she returned to Iran, basically her head would be on a platter, basically. And when you see those sorts of things, like it really, I think, puts it into context just how serious these situations are in countries like Iran. When you think about these stories, you hear these stories, but it doesn't really hit home until you actually hear about people who have sort of had to leave, and like if they ever were to return, they would be killed.
Yeah.
And it's just yeah, it's unfortunate, but I think it puts it into context that despite all the stuff that's going on here right now, there are certainly are places where things are a lot worse.
No doubt. No doubt. Yeah. That's the important context, I think. Well, listen. I so appreciate the time. I'm going to be working on all of these things very powerfully and continuing a strict training regimen. Do you recommend any physical exercise in particular? Like, for example, are push-ups better than pull-ups to prepare for chess or anything like that?
I don't think that shouldn't really play a role. I think like the main thing is like do you like mentally do you get tired quickly or not? First off,
I mean, I
like if
guess
you
it
focus
depends
on
compared
some
to who.
like I guess if you were to focus on not even chess specifically, but something that's mental for like a game, for example, for like an hour or two, would you get tired quickly or not?
Well, listen, video games, they bore me, so I just would never play them for 2 hours. But certainly, I mean, today, listen, I produced my entire 90-minute show, did a 2 hour stream, and then now we've been doing this close to 2 hours, and I don't feel like, oh my God, I got to go to bed or anything like that.
Yeah, then I think I wouldn't even worry. If you have energy, then it shouldn't play a role because you're not going to be playing for more than probably an hour. Your match will be 2 games, so it won't be more than 1 hour when you're playing your match. So it shouldn't really matter.
Got it. Okay. Okay. I mean, listen, if you can sit through people saying maybe inject a bleach into your body and not have to immediately abort, maybe a 10-minute chess game is something I could do, you know?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's a crazy world out there, but I like what you do, and it's great that you're competing in this event. Just I hope you have fun, and I'm sure I can help you during the event as well once it gets going, because people will probably be wanting lessons as well. So if you want to do this again, just let me know.
Oh, I'm available. Yeah, no, thanks to you and all the coaches have been great, and I hope your viewers did not find themselves totally disgusted with my presence on your stream today.
No, I think everybody enjoyed it, so it was a lot of fun, and we should do it again.
All right, thank you so much. I'll talk to you soon.
Great, no problem. Talk to you soon.
All right, see ya.
Bye.
All right, wow. I'm lying. I'm exhausted from that. I've got to go immediately to bed. No, I'm kidding. That was really great, and we're gonna post that definitely to YouTube. And just wild stuff is happening here from the standpoint of the tournament. I do want to say thanks to King D Pie for the Twitch Prime subscription. Oh, Gotha, I didn't even realize Levy raided me with a party of 307. I just missed it completely. I appreciate that. We're going to do something again soon. Zach Caddy. And I'm being asked to raid, actually, the Surfs. Yeah, let's raid the Surfs. That's a small-ish channel, no offense or anything, and we want to support them. So let's do it. We're going to raid the Surfs. We're going to raid Lance. I'm going to go over and make sure I'm watching that myself. And I think it's going to be very, very exciting. All right, ready, guys? Here we go.